Hi everyone, it's Laura and welcome to this lecture entitled Fat Studies Meets Disability Studies. I've just got a painting there on my front slide for anyone interested. It's a Lucian Freud painting just simply entitled Woman on a Couch, which is exactly what it is. It's a fat woman, nude, lying on a couch, and I guess unlike some images that we find on perhaps television, for example, like something in a Dove advert or whatever, it's a painting that really paints a fat body as it does actually look. In terms of, lots of flesh flopping about, flesh that's dimpled, etc. It's not something that's been airbrushed. So just thinking about what we're going to cover then in this lecture. I'm going to start off by trying to deconstruct, if you like, the dominant obesity discourse that we currently have in the West in particular. And then we're going to think a little bit about how fatness and disability intersect. And in particular, as I'm going through this lecture, what I'd like you to be doing is to perhaps make some notes about how disability studies and fat studies have got kind of similar goals, if you like. So think about, as I talk about fatness, fat studies, think about how that might relate to disability and disability studies. What things do they have in common, but perhaps what differences might there be? Okay. So fat studies, it is a thing. I first got involved in a fat women's group when I lived in London, and interestingly, Charlotte Cooper I'm citing on this slide, she was actually the person who set up the group and ran it. I didn't stay in it for very long, but the group, and it was one of many right across the UK, and I'm talking now about the I guess the early to mid 90s, when I was a member of this group, and a lot of the work that we did was around various kind of campaigns against, in particular, things like advertising, but also campaigns around access to clothes in larger sizes and things like that. So it is a thing. There are a number of books now on fat studies, some of which I'm drawing on today. So it is actually a thing. So Charlotte Cooper here, who is probably one of the biggest writers in the UK around fat studies, she suggests that the emergence of fat activism and fat studies is about challenging cultural attitudes towards fatness, including the dominant model of obesity, which encourages the stigmatization and discrimination of fat people. Rothblum, who is editor of a book called Fat Studies, she proposes that it seeks no opposition to the simple fact of human weight diversity, but instead looks at what people and societies make of this reality. So, similar to disability studies is not about saying that people don't have impairment and that those impairments can create difficulties for a person. And so it's similar to that. So it's not suggesting that there aren't people of varying sizes across our societies, but it's about the way in which we make sense of that, if you like. And myself and Erin, we've written a chapter called The Fat Child, which I'm just citing here, we suggest in it that fat people, including fat children, have always existed and always will, but how we choose to make sense of fat bodies and respond to them is shaped by many things, and it's important to examine these. Fatness is not simply a medical discourse, and of course that should sound familiar in terms of you studying disability studies. So in the West in particular, we have this, what we refer to as obesity discourse, and in fat studies we tend to refer to that as the O word. So according to the World Health Organization, it's estimated that there are now over 170 million obese children in the world. And they also suggest that childhood obesity is one of the most serious public health challenges of the 21st century, with the fear that fat children turn into fat adults and that this leads to numerous health problems. So there's a tendency to obviously to discuss fatness in very negative terms, but also uses of the words kind of epidemic and things like that make kind of cause this sense of panic, if you like, that we have this this serious epidemic that is spreading across the world, and as Cooper says here, there is that sense of the idea of it being epidemic. She says that it's a rhetorical device to leverage fat panic, and newspapers in particular, there's hardly a day goes by, although perhaps not so much at the minute in terms of news, but there has been this sense of setting up this sense of panic about the number of fat people that there are. And of course, when we think about this idea of something being an epidemic, I mean, if you think about the pandemic, an epidemic is associated with disease and something that's out of control and in need of eradication. But of course, the reality is, fatness isn't a disease. And while we might see there might be statistics that suggest that there are increased numbers of fat people in the West. It's just this kind of scaremongering tactics that are being used in terms of talking about fat people. And one of the issues that we have is actually the way in which fatness is presented in the news in particular. So that idea of it's presented here as some kind of truth. And a classic example of that is the way in which some of the statistics are delivered to kind of viewers or readers of the news in terms of the ways in which things might link. And this is really problematic because, as I say, there's generally hardly a week that goes by when fatness doesn't get linked to heart disease or to cancer. Is a classic one. We've seen it in terms of COVID, it being linked with COVID. Now, the problem with these types of studies is that if you simply look at, so if we take, let's take for example, breast cancer. So this idea that fatness can cause breast cancer. Okay, there's not any evidence that supports that. So Oliver says here, while a link might well be made between a high BMI body mass index, and mortality, this does not necessarily mean that it was body fat that killed people. Okay, so although you might see an increase in, for example, the number of women who have got breast cancer, and more of them are women who are fatter, that doesn't actually prove that it's fat tissue that has caused cancer. Yeah. So, and you know, similarly, Oliver here is using actually death, premature death. So while the numbers might be that a certain percentage, a high percentage of people who die, I don't know, before the age of 70 are fat people, that doesn't tell you that it is fatness per se that causes premature death, for example. So, as Guthman here says, several of the tools used to describe and represent the obesity epidemic confuse the relationship between size and illness. So, to present obesity as a health problem, if you like. So, actually, someone being fat does not necessarily equate to someone being unhealthy, if you like. And I'm just showing an image there of the fairly typical BMI chart, whereby you, based on your height, there is a particular weight that you are meant to be. And in a way, this reminds me a little bit of something like an IQ test. We actually know that this is not a particularly useful tool in which to think about people's health, or even people's weight, if you like. So if, for example, you were to take I don't know, an athlete of some description who was quite tall, who had a lot of body, a lot of muscle, etc. Then if they were to be plotted on this graph, then they are likely to be considered obese. But we know for a fact that their body makeup is much more likely to be made up of muscle. Okay, so it doesn't take into account muscle, it doesn't take into account things like bone density. So if I take myself as an example, I'm 5'8", but I am quite a large frame. I'm fat, I don't have a problem with that, I am fat, that's absolutely fine. But similarly, Ted, my son, he's the same. He's over 6 foot now. He's a large frame, and my bone density is quite considerable. So even before I was really considered a fat woman, I would have scored as being overweight even when I wasn't. Yeah, because of the size of my frame, etc. So it's not a useful way of measuring not just people's health, obviously, but also just people's weight, because there are so many things that we need to, but yet still, and as I say, this is where I draw the likeness with IQ test, still we know that it's a flawed tool, but we still continue to use it as though it's not remotely problematic. In fat studies, we take issue with the word obesity. Really, it comes from the Latin obedia, ob, meaning over, and adea, meaning eat. Yeah, overeat, and that automatically conjoins fatness with eating, as opposed to lots of other factors that can cause fatness, side effects of medication, genetics, various medical conditions, etc. It isn't always about how many calories someone consumes. And in addition, it ignores possible social and environmental causes. It tends to create this kind of misconception that the cause of fatness is always overeating, as well. So hence the reason we tend to avoid it in fat studies. And on this screen then I'm just showing a couple of examples of the way in which fat children in particular are represented in the news. So I'm showing two. I'm fairly certain they're either I think they're Daily Mail. I can't remember. So headline here, so photograph of young boy, you don't see his head, but he has a fat body. For some unknown reason, he's either in boxer shorts or pyjamas, and there's a tape measure around his waist. The headline is the lard knock life. Parents need to show their kids tough love to stop them gorging on so many snacks and becoming obese, warns NHS chief. Similarly, there's another article that next to that. I don't know whether that's the same child, but it's a really degrading photograph of a young fat boy kind of pulling a kind of angry face, holding a large cheeseburger. Ignorant, and the headline is "Ignorance is Bliss, doting mums to blame for their kids being obese, as 90% don't think their tubby offspring are too fat." So we see these often really kind of very degrading images of fat bodies in the media. And I'm just showing a fairly hideous article that actually was in the Telegraph. That the headline was, "If you're a parent of a fat child, you're a bad parent." And I'll just read this out, and perhaps you might want to just pause the video at this point. But it says, "Lazy, selfish parents would rather let their child shovel sweets into their gob than take them to the park." So why do so many parents make their kid fat? Because they are, to put it bluntly, selfish and lazy. Because they would rather give their kid quick rubbish than go to any effort to give them a healthy meal. Because they would rather have an easy life and say yes to every whimsical demand from a 5-year-old for chocolate for breakfast than say no and face the consequences. Because they would rather leave their child to spend 8 hours on an Xbox than go to the effort of taking them out to the park. Because they would prefer to shove sweets into their child's mouth than have to bother listening to them when they'd rather be watching TV or playing on their iPhone. Just take a drink. So a scathing article there of again a kind of something that I think is particularly common in the kind of obesity discourse, and that is its kind of connection, if you like, with working class. So there's a definite issue around class, and again, whenever you see images in the news, etc., you can bet your bottom dollar that they are images of people in track suits with a stretched over a t-shirt over their belly, maybe a bit of belly sticking out and whatever. They're not they're not men in suits who are fat. There's a definite class thing that goes on in the way in which fat people are targeted. And the same again here, this person talking about you know, that idea that people can't be bothered. So rather than taking their children to the park, for example, and that's as a result of individual selfishness and laziness. So there's a horrible link that often goes with fatness, fat people being lazy. Um, and um, and of course, again, you know, I can think of, you know, if I think about some of the ways in which over the years I kind of have perhaps opted for not such great choice of evening meal. Um, that hasn't been because I'm selfish and lazy. It's been because I'm knackered. I'm absolutely knackered. You know, I raised my son single-handedly. I have an incredibly demanding job that means that I work a lot of long hours. When Ted was a chorister and singing for the cathedral, the last thing I had the energy to do after I'd, you know, worked, you know, 10 hours and then gone and collected him from the cathedral was to then come home and start to make something. And so we would often find ourselves, as with many of the chorister families, in the drive-through McDonald's on County Road, for example. So it's you know, it is just a fairly typical response. And we object to this idea then that fatness must equal poor health. Um, I would not consider myself, although I experience, you know, issues around my mental health. Um, I'm not a physically unhealthy person. Um, But there is a tendency always to think that fatness equals poor health. And I know for a fact that there are probably some of you, I don't know, perhaps some of you who are not as healthy as I am, but are not fat. And in a way, what we need to recognise is that there are many industries who are invested in that narrative, if you like, that fatness equals poor health. O'Dea here argues that it should be of serious concern that childhood obesity is being influenced by those who aim to make a profit from treatments, especially given that any weight loss achieved does not guarantee the various health benefits. So for sure, people may well lose weight, etc. Doesn't necessarily mean that that translates into they then are leading healthy lives, if you like. And I'm just showing a series of images here that are from the kind of beauty industry, if you like. So there are various adverts for gyms, makeup, face products. There are, of course, now as many, well, not as many, but an increasing number of products aimed at men and not just women. And we need to recognise that that as an industry has got a huge investment in making people feel that they're not healthy enough, that their bodies aren't good enough, etc., etc., because it's then their products or their services which you feel that you have to invest in order to make your body look better or to become more healthier. Similarly, I'm now showing images here. It just makes me so cross. Images of various weight loss clubs, Slimming World, Weight Watchers, which I think is WW now, etc. So recognising that they come under some kind of criticism, but they're all forced. You know, they are things that I'm sorry to say that, but don't really work. I'm sure also showing some weight reduction surgery in process there. Slim Fast, Jane Plan, I could just smack in the face. you know, some wealthy white, you know, woman, who's going to change your life, and she's raking in the millions. And I've got other various diets there. So you need to recognize that this industry plays an enormous role in actually making life worse for a lot of fat people. My mom sent me to a slimming club at a very early age, and it was absolutely torturous, you know, getting weighed in front of people, other people knowing whether you'd lost or you hadn't lost, etc, etc. They do nothing more than increase your misery, really. And generally speaking, for sure, people might lose weight first time round, but most people who are fat are repeat. I have a dear friend that I've had since school, and how much Slimming World must have made from her, I don't know, because she goes back and then she stops and then she goes back and then she stopped, and she's the same age as me, 52, and she's done that for, you know, almost as long as I have known her. So they're not they're not good places. Also now just showing photographs then of various advertisements of what might be considered unhealthy food. There's a Skittles advert, a Coke advert, digestive biscuits, Cadbury, Cocoa Pops, Fox's biscuits, etc. So again, lots of things rammed down our throat, you know, particularly at the minute in terms of kind of, you know, various Christmas products. And although there have been some changes in terms of particularly advertising to children, essentially they do, you know, there still remains a most definite targeting of young children. If we think about the, you know, the toy that goes with the kids' meals at McDonald's, for example, you know, they're often cute. You know, you've got the panda there advertising the Fox's chocolate biscuits, and the little kitten advertising the digestive biscuits, etc. So, you know, they're very clever in targeting. And quite frankly, you know, if you're a woman who's a lone parent who has to work 2 jobs in order to be able to feed your 3 kids, etc., I actually might also be too knackered to when you've got your kid you know, whinging in the supermarket, to not put in the unhealthy snack just to shut them up. And one of the things I guess frustrates many of us then is that you know, the government introduced something called the Childhood Obesity a plan of action, and I guess what is annoying is that actually rather typically it's about the individual needing to make the change. Yeah, so it isn't about, you know, there's nothing in that plan of action that's about reducing poverty. There's nothing in that plan of action that's about reducing fat stigma and fat prejudice, which at the end of the day causes people to eat. Yeah, if you are sad, or you are lonely, or you are stressed, etc, etc, there is nothing more comforting than food. There isn't enough being done still in terms of, although they brought in a sugar levy, but just the sheer volume of sugar that goes into particular products. There's nothing in it about tackling that. And here it says a number of its plans have the potential to increase body shame in children and young people. Body shame being an acute affective experience stemming from perceptions of having failed to achieve the narrowly defined cultural standards of body size. So these government plans don't take any of those other kinds of debates and other kinds of issues to do with fat people. And interestingly, bullying, in terms of when bullying, children are bullied, something that's, not the same with necessarily with disabled children. It isn't, bullying is not a problem with society. Yeah, it's a problem for the individual. So when a fat child is bullied, it is their fat that is to blame, not society's treatment of an attitude towards fatness. The solution is therefore weight loss, as opposed to tackling the stigma and prejudice associated with occupying a socially unacceptable body. And yeah, so this idea of kind of weight-based kind of stigma and weight-based prejudice then is something that is rarely ever discussed in terms of how it is going to support people to perhaps live healthier lives. Poole and Latner here identified educators, parents and peers as the primary sources of fat prejudice in the lives of disabled children, and there have been some really awful studies in terms of the age of which children start to become prejudiced against fat people. There's a study there, 2016, found that preschool age children were being prejudiced towards other fat children. And there are lots and lots of other studies like that. Interestingly, there's been lots of studies that have looked at children, whether they would want to be friends with other children who are disabled, or other children who are fat. And generally speaking, children would sooner have friendships with disabled children than they would fat children. Yeah. What I'd like you to do now then is I would just like you to pause the video and just based on hopefully some of the notes that you have been taking, I'd like you to just think about how fat studies and disability studies then intersect. At what points do they converge? And at what point might they diverge? So how might they be similar? And then how might they be different? So pause the video. Okay, well hopefully you've written some things down there. So in terms of convergence then, I would think that these are the kind of main ways in which they are similar. So that idea then of fatness and impairment being seen as problematic, but a problem that's within the individual themselves. That the aim for both impairment and fatness is to fix or change the individual, not society. Again, the whole medicalisation, the whole way in which disabled people are the dominant discourses around comes from medicine, so it's viewed as a medical condition, and it's the same in terms of the way in which fatness is the discourse around fatness is very much medicalised. There are overlaps in terms of ideas of normalcy, what the normal body should look like, what it should do. There are similar issues in terms of the language that it can be used that can create stigma. Fat studies and disability studies they're both about providing alternative narratives. So both are not about saying that impairment and fatness doesn't exist. Of course they do, yeah, but it's about the fact that contrary to the dominant discourse, there are other narratives and often counter narratives to that discourse. That there is that people experience prejudice. If you're disabled or if you're fat, they can often, although I would say that representations of impairment and disability are getting better. In terms of representations of fat people, there's still real issues there, and there are still real issues as well in terms of representations of disability, and they're both political. So it's about politicizing the body and the way in which bodies are conceptualized in society. I think in terms of where they differ, then I actually think the emotional response is what is different. So for many people who perhaps see a disabled child, for example, we have the yeah, so there is a pity, there is a sense of perhaps compassion or misplaced pity. The emotional response to a fat child is generally one of repugnance, of that fat bodies are revolting, etc. So as opposed to someone feeling sorry for the person. So I think the emotional response that we get is really quite different, and that's largely because of this other thing then, and that is in terms of blame. So I think again one of the things that makes disability and fatness different is that people don't necessarily go around looking at disabled children and thinking it's all their fault that they're disabled, or it's their mother's fault they're disabled, etc. Whereas there is huge amounts of blame amongst blame of fat children, and in that case it's generally their parents. And then if you're a fat old adult, then you are seen as the person to blame. Okay, my dears, there's my references. You take care now.